Their tent poles had been replaced overnight with ones carved from bone-white wood. For a long moment none of them moved. The tent stood exactly where they had left it, silvered with dawn moisture, guy lines sagging with beads of water. But the aluminum poles they had carried in were gone. In their place rose pale shafts the color of old teeth, smooth in some places and ridged in others, as if something fibrous had once lived beneath the surface and been scraped away. Mara stepped closer first. Wet needles compressed under her boots. She crouched and touched one of the poles with 2 fingers. It was cold, not morning air cold, a deeper cold, like stone pulled from river mud. "Did one of you do this?" she asked. Eli gave a short laugh that died immediately. "How would we even do that?" John stood with his arms folded. He had slept badly. At some point in the night he had woken and stayed awake, staring at the tent ceiling while silence pressed from every direction. No wind, no insects, no creak. It had felt less like quiet and more like the forest was listening. "Nobody came in," he said, though even as he said it he knew it wasn't true. He hadn't heard anyone because there had been almost nothing to hear. Priya circled the tent. "There aren't any tracks." The ground was damp from a brief rain before dawn. Their own footprints were clear around camp. Beyond those, the soil was smooth. No drag marks, no snapped twigs, no sign that 4 long poles had been carried in. Mara pressed her thumb against the white surface. "This doesn't feel like wood." "It is wood," Eli said too quickly. She looked at him. "What tree is white all the way through?" No one answered. They had hiked beyond the marked trail the day before, following an old logging road until it dissolved into moss and shadow. By late afternoon they had found the clearing beside a narrow creek and decided to stay. The map showed no cabins or roads for kilometers. Cell signal had vanished hours earlier. John remembered how relieved they had been when they stopped walking. Now the clearing looked smaller. The trees seemed to have edged closer during the night. He gripped one of the poles and pulled. It flexed with a faint elastic resistance. Not metal, not dead wood either. The texture under his palm felt almost skinless. "Take it down," Priya said. The first pole came free with effort. As John slid it from the sleeve, the tent fabric whispered along its length. Close it was worse. The pale surface held branching lines, faint as veins under wax. Near one end the white deepened to a translucent yellow. "That wasn't carved," Mara said quietly. John understood. Carved meant tools. Hands. Deliberate shaping. This looked grown. They laid it on the ground. It made almost no sound. By the time the last pole was out, the morning had brightened, but the light under the trees remained strangely flat. No birds crossed the clearing. Even the creek sounded quieter than yesterday. They packed in silence. Nobody said they should leave. It settled among them as something too obvious to speak. An hour later they were walking south by compass. At first John thought the forest only felt different because of nerves. Then he realized the undergrowth had thinned. Ferns that had brushed their knees yesterday were gone. Long patches of ground lay bare beneath old needles. The trunks stood farther apart. It should have made walking easier. Instead it made him feel exposed, as if the woods had stepped back to watch. He kept turning around. Nothing followed them. That was the worst part. No movement, no sound. Yet whenever he stopped he felt a tension gathering just beyond sight. By noon the air had become sharply cold. They paused beside a fallen cedar. Priya checked the compass again. "South. We've been going south for hours," Eli said. "We started late. We should have crossed the creek." John said nothing. He had been thinking the same thing. The creek had run north to south. If they were moving downhill they should have met it again. Instead the forest had become unfamiliar in a way that resisted memory. Not different trees, just trees stripped of anything that made them distinct. Mara had wandered several steps away. She pointed at the ground. A pale shaving lay curled among the needles. John picked it up. Bone white, thin as paper. One side smooth, the other fibrous. It looked freshly pared. "From the poles?" Eli asked. There were more. Once John saw the first, He saw several scattered ahead of them, delicate curls lying across the dark forest floor, as if something in the trees had been quietly whittling. Nobody spoke after that. In mid-afternoon, Mara stopped abruptly. There was another clearing. Not theirs. Smaller, ringed tightly with spruce. In the center stood 4 pale poles driven upright into the ground. Nothing connected them. No canvas. No rope. No sign of human use. Just the poles. They were taller than the ones from the tent. Their surfaces caught the light with the dull sheen of submerged bone. Along one, John saw bulges at uneven intervals, joints, not knots. His stomach tightened. "Keep moving," Priya said. They did. As they passed, John glanced sideways. The poles formed a rectangle. Inside it, the earth was darker than the rest of the clearing, almost black, as if recently turned or long saturated. He nearly stumbled over a root. At dusk, they found the creek again. Relief hit hard. The water ran black between stones. John recognized the split cedar leaning over the bank. They had circled back. "That's impossible," Eli said. But it wasn't. It was there. The light was draining quickly. Their choices were simple. Keep walking blind or make camp. "We stay here," Priya said. "No tent," Mara said. "We have the tarp." Nobody wanted to touch the white poles. They left them where they had fallen. They strung the tarp between 2 living trees. By the time they crawled underneath, darkness had thickened into something almost physical. The creek moved nearby, but even that sound seemed muffled, as though heard through layers of soil. No fire. John lay awake. Time stretched strangely. He could hear Eli's breathing, the small click in Priya's knee, Mara swallowing once in the dark. Then he heard it. A delicate sound. Dry. Fibrous. A soft creak. He held his breath. Came again. Not footsteps. Not branches in wind. More intimate. A minute pressure of something bending. Beside him, Eli had gone rigid. "Do you hear that?" Mara whispered. Everyone had. The sound did not move around them. It traveled through the trees, passing from trunk to trunk so quietly John lost all sense of direction. He sat up slowly. Beyond the tarp stood a pale vertical shape. Then another. Then another. 4 of them stood at the clearing's edge. No, 5. The white surfaces caught almost no light, yet they were visible with dreadful clarity. Too straight to be trunks. Too pale. Too near. One of the shapes leaned. Not toward them. Toward the ground. A slow, deliberate inclination as though listening. Priya made a strangled sound. The creak suddenly seemed louder, and the spell broke. Eli snapped on the flashlight. The beam shook across bark, ferns, water. Nothing. Only trees. They did not sleep again. At first light, they followed the creek downhill. Within an hour, the trees thinned. Another half-hour later, they stepped onto the logging road. At the car, Mara emptied her pack. Among the stove fuel and damp socks lay a pail shaving. "I didn't put that there," she said. Nobody answered. Weeks passed. The memory thinned. Fatigue. Fear. Bad navigation. Easy explanations. Then one night rain woke John. He went to close the kitchen window. His apartment overlooked a small courtyard. At its center stood an ornamental maple. Water ran down the trunk. At first he thought a branch had fallen and lodged upright beside it. Then lightning whitened the courtyard. Not a branch. A pale pole stood half sunk in the mud. He stared until the next flash. It seemed closer to the tree than before, leaning inward. Morning should have made it harmless. Didn't. He went downstairs. The courtyard smelled of wet concrete. The maple dripped overhead. There was no pale pole. He almost laughed. Then he saw the trunk. The bark had split in a narrow seam. Inside, beneath the wet dark wood, something white showed through. He stepped back. Above him leaves stirred though the air was still. Not many, only a few. Yet the sound was unmistakable, the dry fibrous creak he had heard in the forest. He looked up. Along the inner branches, the wood had begun to pale. Higher still, half hidden among leaves, several branches were bending toward one another with impossible patience. not growing outward, drawing inward, learning in silence how to make a frame. The forest canopy above them rippled like water whenever they looked up. At first Eli thought it was dizziness. They had been climbing for nearly 2 hours through fir and cedar, and when Nora stopped to retie her bootlace, he stood with both hands on his hips, breathing through the ache in his ribs. He tipped his head back once. The green ceiling moved, not wind. The trunks around them were still. Yet high above, the canopy folded in a slow pulse, leaves shivering outward in widening rings as if something had dropped into a lake suspended over their heads. He lowered his eyes so fast his neck hurt. "You saw that," he said. Sanaa was already staring upward. "Jesus. Probably heat," Cal said. "There isn't any heat." She was right. The air beneath the trees had grown colder with every switchback. It smelled of wet bark, pine sap, and stone. Nora looked up. The canopy rippled again. She stepped backward. "Okay. No." Light shifted across their faces. Late sun filtering through the branches had turned strangely liquid, thin bands of gold bending over bark and sliding away. Eli felt pressure in both ears, as if they had climbed another 1,000 feet in a second. Cal started walking. "Camp's another mile." They followed because standing there had become unbearable. At first the forest stayed ordinary enough to argue with. Tall gray trunks rose through fern and moss. Granite pushed through the soil. A woodpecker tapped somewhere downhill. Their packs whispered against jackets. Then Sanaa said, "Do you hear the creek?" Eli stopped. The map showed water running below the ridge. They had heard it since noon, a constant cold rushing through the trees. Now there was nothing. "Maybe it bends away," Kel said. "No. Listen." They listened. No creek. No insects. No distant birds. Only breathing. Then from high overhead came a faint drawn noise, like fingers passing slowly across stretched fabric. All four of them looked up. The canopy rippled. Closer this time. Not merely moving above them but through itself. Branches seemed to fold over layers that should not have existed. Eli had the sick impression that the sky had become very far away. For half a second he thought he was looking into depth rather than upward into air. He dropped his gaze. "Don't keep doing that," he said. "Doing what?" Nora asked. "Looking." They kept walking. The trail narrowed until ferns brushed their knees. Every few minutes someone glanced up without meaning to. Every time the canopy answered. At a bend Sanaa stopped so abruptly Eli nearly walked into her. Their footprints marked the damp soil behind them. Ahead, the trail continued unbroken. But between those two stretches there was a clean patch of earth, untouched, as though their last several steps had been lifted out of the ground. "We just walked through there," she whispered. "We're close," Kel said too quickly. No one argued after that. The campsite appeared just as the light began thinning. It was only a shallow clearing ringed by old trunks, a blackened fire ring, and a fallen cedar silvered with age. The sight of it gave Eli a brief rush of relief. They dropped their packs. The silence had followed them. Usually forests changed at dusk. Birds traded places. Insects started up. Here the quiet felt shaped, as if it occupied the spaces between trunks and held itself there. Cal collected wood. Nora unrolled tents. Sanaa found a trickle of water downhill. Eli crouched over the stove. "Don't look up," Nora said suddenly. She was standing very still in the middle of the clearing. "Why?" "It's doing it anyway." The light. He saw it then. Even with their heads lowered, pale bands were sliding over the trunks. The shadows around camp moved in slow concentric pulses, dimming and brightening as though the air itself were breathing. They ate without appetite. Every sound seemed slightly displaced. When Nora unzipped a pocket, Eli heard it from his left though she sat across the fire ring. When Kel snapped a twig, it seemed to come from high overhead. By full dark the clearing had become an island. Their headlamps reached only a few trunks before being swallowed. Above them there should have been stars through the gaps. There were none. "I don't like that," Sanaa said. "The sky." "Clouds," Cal said. There weren't clouds. Nora hugged her knees. I think it notices when we look. No one answered. They crawled into their tents early. Eli slept badly. He kept surfacing into the dark with the feeling that he had heard something just beyond the nylon. Once he thought he heard footsteps. Once a faint whisper of rain. Sometime after midnight he woke to his name. Eli. He sat up so fast Sanaa stirred beside him. Eli. Not a voice. More like sound arranging itself into shape. He unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The clearing was washed in thin greenish light. Not moonlight. Something colder. Then Eli looked up. The entire canopy was turning. Not rippling now. Turning. Vast dark layers folded inward with enormous patience, as though deep water circled a drain. Between the moving branches he saw impossible depth. Black-green distance receding beyond anything the forest should have contained. His balance lurched. He dropped to one knee. And suddenly he understood what had been wrong since afternoon. The motion was centered on them. Sanaa stood behind him, barefoot. Don't, he said. But she already had. Her breath caught. There's something wrong with the stars. Cal burst from his tent and stopped. Then Nora screamed. Not upward. Into the trees. She stood at the edge of the clearing, headlamp shaking. There's someone there. Eli aimed his light. No person. Only trunks, fern, wet stone. But on the bark of the nearest cedar for pale vertical marks gleamed fresh through the moss, as though something had pressed hard enough to expose clean wood beneath. Cal started toward them. Cal, Eli said. He kept walking. The beam from his headlamp drifted deeper among the trunks. Cal. He stopped where the light had already begun to thin. I'm right. The last word blurred. Not with distance. With direction. Eli heard it ahead of him. Sanaa heard it behind. Nora turned upward so violently she stumbled. Then silence. Cal did not come back. No one wanted to leave the clearing, but staying there became its own terror. The pale pulses overhead kept moving. At one point footsteps circled just beyond the ring of light, slow and careful, matching the rhythm of breathing. When Eli swept his beam through the trees, the ground was untouched. Toward dawn something cold struck the back of his hand. A drop of water. Another landed on Sanaa's sleeve. It isn't raining, she whispered. Eli lifted his light. The canopy rippled, and for a moment he saw dozens of wet gleams suspended overhead. Not falling. Hanging in the folds of moving leaves. He thought they were droplets. Then one of them closed. He lowered the beam so violently he nearly dropped it. Morning came without sunrise. The darkness simply thinned enough for shape to return. Cal was gone. So were his footprints. The pale marks remained on the cedar. There were 5 now. They packed in silence. No one suggested searching. They found the trail by descending. Twice Eli was certain they passed the same split stump. Once Sanaa stopped and said she could hear someone walking overhead, branch answering boot step in perfect time. Hours later they stumbled onto the access road. Signal returned all at once. 3 phones vibrating with delayed messages, weather alerts, missed calls. The ordinary world rushed back so abruptly it made Eli sway. At the ranger station they reported Cal missing. Search teams went in that afternoon. They found the campsite, the fire ring, the fallen cedar, the tents exactly where they had left them. They found no trace of Cal. At night he still heard the forest in small city sounds. Rain gutters whispered like distant branches. Elevator cables hummed with the same stretched metallic note he had heard above the trail. Sometimes he woke with his ears aching and the taste of cold water at the back of his throat. Weeks passed. Sanaa stopped answering messages. Nora sent one short text. I can't sleep if there's a window above the bed. Then vanished too. Eli returned to the city and tried to let concrete and traffic flatten what had happened. Sometimes it almost worked. Then he would step beneath scaffolding or an awning and feel pressure building quietly in his ears. He stopped looking up. One evening he was waiting at a crosswalk after rain. Office windows across the street had gone black with reflection. He looked at them without thinking. The city should have been there. Instead he saw green depth, branches folding slowly inward. The crowd moved around him, umbrellas brushing shoulders, shoes hissing over wet pavement. Nobody stopped. Nobody looked. In the glass, the canopy rippled once. Then the reflected darkness changed in a small, deliberate way, like a pupil narrowing. And for the first time, he understood that it had never been watching from above. It had only been learning where to place its eyes.